Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prana Nata Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Madhupananya Vilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudabam Murdna Nipatyakshito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupo Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Iha Viharati Radha Krishna Kunjadikari Tarubhaya Rasarite Shuddha Siddhanta Dhari Sakala Sujana Geya Krishna Dasa Videya Padamakila Gunanam Kaviraja Kavinam Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhaktamaj Jai Rachido Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Na Hoilo Murachita Jeva Nahi Buji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Chaitanya Charit Krishna Upajibe Priti Janibe Raserariti Shunile Borohoihit Shriyatam Shriyatam Nityam Giyatam Giyatam Mura Chintyatam Chintyatam Bhaktash Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana-avatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, nourished by Shri Rup, Shri Sanatan, and Shri Raghunath, a graceful swan in the inexhaustible reservoir of Gaura Lila, wherefrom the very essence of Krishna Lila streams in the 10 directions, Shri Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami Pad. Again, today we continue our discussion of Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. And in particular, we're in the section defining Sadhana-bhakti. So in our last discussion, we covered the definition of sadhana found in the Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu, and we looked at the commentaries of Jiva Gosvami Pad and Visvanatha Cakravarti Pad on this verse. So today we'll give a little extended discussion about the implications of the points made in these commentaries, and if we have time then we'll get on to the 2 payars here in the Caritamrta itself that also gloss or explain the meaning of this verse. So there's a fresh file, and I'm just starting off the top of that. So, but I'll just reread the extended rendering of the verse that I gave at the end of the last file, just to recap the subject matter of discussion. So if we apply the points made in the previous commentaries, then we can explain the definition as follows. When that, namely Uttama Bhakti, is kriti sadhya, to be accomplished by actions of the senses, and is to sadhya bhava, that by which bhava is to be accomplished, then it is called sadhana-bhakti. Hearing this, one may wonder, if bhava has to be accomplished, then is bhava a previously non-existent and thus non-eternal entity that becomes created, and is thus unfit to be accepted as the ultimate purushartha, because everything that is created will inevitably be destroyed, and anything that is subject to destruction is unfit to be the ultimate purushartha? No. Why? eternally accomplished bhava, manifestation into the heart, is its sadhyata, or its being an object to be accomplished. That is, bhava is not an existent created by sadhana-bhakti. It is an eternal existent, only the manifestation of which into the heart comes about by means of sadhana-bhakti, and thus it is fit to be accepted as the ultimate purushartha. So this is the overall import of the verse. So that's where we ended off last time. So now I'm starting off the fresh file and just a little more discussion of the terminology and the intent in the verse. So, to understand the manner of composition and import of this definition, it is helpful to recognize that it is composed using 4 words derived from the root siddh, namely sadhya, sadhana, siddha, and sadhyata, all of which are commonly employed in the technical language of fields of knowledge like grammar and logic. The root siddh generally means to be accomplished, but can convey a wide range of meanings according to its context of usage, including those of to exist and to be created or produced. So here the context then is that all throughout this verse you have all these words that are built off the same verbal root siddh. And that verbal root siddh has multiple meanings. One of the meanings is to create something or produce something, and another meaning is to accomplish something or establish something. Or sometimes people render the idea of nitya siddh as, quote, eternally perfected, to perfect something. And more broadly, it can simply to convey the idea of something to exist. So if we're talking then about this notion of siddh, then which is the notion of it that Rupa Gosvami intends to use here? This is if we can get that a singular sense of siddh is being used all throughout the words sadhana, siddha, sadhyata, and sadhya, then the whole meaning of the verse becomes very clear. But a lot of this gets kind of masked if you're just reading an English translation, because the word nitya siddha will be kind of, generically translated as eternally perfect, and then sadhya can be translated as an object or a goal, which is not wrong, but then the relationship between the idea of sadhya and siddha gets totally obscured for someone who's just reading an English set of words. And so the idea that this is a means to bring about the sadhana is the means to the sadhya, and something that has achieved that is now siddha, all of that kind of clarity that you get by understanding the root of the words is lost in that kind of translation. So for that reason, I just tried to show this etymological thread, if you will. So applying that, the word sadhya is employed twice in this verse. In the compound kriti sadhya, where sadhya is spelled with a feminine ending as sadhya, the word conveys that sadhana-bhakti is that to be accomplished by activity, meaning actions of the senses, as was explained in the aforesaid commentaries. In the compound sadhya bhava, the word again means to be accomplished, though it can also be understood more broadly in this case to mean an aim or objective. Sadhana-bhakti is that by which bhava is to be accomplished, that is, sadhana is that the aim or objective of which is bhava. The word sadhana literally means accomplishing, and is commonly used to refer to a means of accomplishment. So what is literally being said in the first half of this definition is that the division of Uttama Bhakti, wherein Uttama Bhakti is accomplishing of something, that is, where it is a means of accomplishment, or sadhana, is the division of Uttama Bhakti wherein Uttama Bhakti functions as a means to bring about bhava's accomplishment. Now, when a reader hears this, they may wonder whether the author intends to convey that bhava is something accomplished in the sense that it is created, which would imply that bhava is non-eternal and subject to future destruction, or to convey that bhava is accomplished not in the sense that it is created, but in the sense that it is brought into manifestation, that is, perceptible presence, which would imply that it is already existent elsewhere rather than its being created by sadhana-bhakti. Anticipating readers may ponder over this ambiguity, Sri Rupa writes the second line of the verse to clarify his intent. He first describes bhava as nitya siddha. So you'll see in the verse that nitya siddhasya, this is the genitive affix, is applied to the word nitya siddha. So that's, more or less, you could say, just for the sake of structuring of the grammar in the verse, but what he's describing when it says nitya siddhasya bhavasya simply means that bhava is nitya siddha, or, quote, eternally accomplished, which in this instance of usage conveys that it is simply eternally existent, and thus not a sadhya in the sense of being something that is being created. He then states that bhava's, quote, sadhyata, or sadhyaness, meaning the sense in which bhava is being described in the definition of sadhana-bhakti as a sadhya, is that it is an eternal existent, a nitya siddha entity, which is being brought into manifestation, or prakatyam, that is, being brought from elsewhere into perceptible presence in the heart, by means of sadhana-bhakti. It is thus not being accomplished in the sense that it is now being created, and thus was not previously non-existent. As such, it is not something subject to destruction, and thus it is fit to be accepted as the ultimate purushartha, since it is an eternal existent, and only an eternal existent, which is never created or destroyed, is fit to be accepted as such. Sriman Mahaprabhu further elucidates this aspect of the definition ahead in Payar 107. So this well-known statement, Nitya Siddha Krishna Prem Sadhya Kabunoi, is the Bengali way of conveying the point made in this second half of the Sanskrit verse. So when we read the Payar in the light of the commentaries on this verse in the Sindhu, then its intent is quite clear. But we'll clarify that further when we get to discussion of that Payar ahead. So before we get there, we'll just look at another important point that came up in the commentary. So, another important point in regard to the qualifier sadhya bhava, stated in this definition of sadhana-bhakti, which was explained by Sri Jiva in his aforecited commentary on this definition, also merits additional discussion. So the point, quote, sadhya bhava, by this qualifier, sadhana-bhakti being that by which another purushartha is to be accomplished, is repudiated. That which has another aim is merely a particular self-directed process. So as we discussed, the idea is that someone might perform an act of bhakti, but that act of bhakti may or may not be what we call sadhana-bhakti. So what makes an act of bhakti qualify as an act of sadhana-bhakti? It has to be an act of bhakti which is performed not as a svarta kriya vishesh, or an activity which is self-directed or is merely for some aim or attainment of oneself, but rather is performed with the aim of attaining bhava, or bringing about the manifestation of bhava. So if someone performs an act of bhakti merely with the hope of, achieving some worldly gain or getting some particular personal benefit out of it, then that might be an act of bhakti in the most broad sense, but it doesn't fit the definition of Rupa Goswami's sadhana-bhakti. So, earlier in his teachings to Sri Rupa Sriman Mahaprabhu also conveyed this teaching as follows. Quote, if desires for enjoyment, mukti, and so forth are present in the heart, even when one engages in sadhana, prema does not manifest. Rati arises from sadhana-bhakti, that is, not bhakti done with desires for objects other than rati. And when rati becomes intense, it is called prema. In this context, the following verse of Sri Rupa from Bhakti-rasamrta-sindhu is also mentioned. Quote, as long as the fiends of desire for enjoyment and mukti remain in the heart, how can the joy of bhakti appear here? So essentially, what is the desire that's motivating the enactment of bhakti? This will determine how the bhakti is categorized. Sri Jivapad comments on this verse that desires for enjoyment and mukti are, quote, possessed of self-directed intention, or svanmukha tatparyavati. So this is, you can say if you read closely, if you see how he comments here on the Sindhu, artantaram svartakriya vishesh, and now over here in the Priti Sandarbha, in this other part of the Sindhu commentary, he uses this phrase, sva unmukha tatparya. So, as we've discussed throughout this chapter of the Caitanya-caritamrta, the abhideya of the Shastra, the directive the whole Shastra is trying to teach, what is that fundamentally? Samukya, or Krishna unmukata, to be oriented towards Krishna, or to be facing Krishna, or intent upon Krishna. So now Jiva Gosvami uses that same word, unmuk, but speaks of sva unmuk. In other words, not being Krishna-facing, but being self-facing, or in other words, being, concerned principally with oneself rather than with Krishna. So, what is a desire? He's defining desire as that the intent of which is focused on oneself. So if one's enactment of bhakti is being motivated by an orientation which is fundamentally self-facing, can that qualify as the abhideya, which is defined as Krishna unmukata, or Krishna-facing? No. It's not a complicated analysis. The conclusion is not complicated, but to go into that fundamental psychological orientation of things is, you could say, a genius, or a very great elucidation of the whole nature of spiritual practice by Jiva Gosvami. So he also makes this point elsewhere by saying in Priti Sandarbha 78, he describes priti, that is prema for Krishna, as, quote, intolerant of any other intent, tatparyantaram asahamana, meaning any intent other than one focused on priti's object, namely Krishna, and favorability, or anukulya, activity pleasing to Krishna. So this comes in the beautiful section of the Anucheda 78, where Jiva Gosvami compares priti to a feminine form, and then describes her ornaments, her character, her demeanor, etc., uses all of these things as metaphoric basis for explaining the nature of priti. So he, how does it go? How does it start? Oh, it just slips my mind just now. Tatparyantaram asahamana. What's the part before that? Oh, it doesn't come to my mind just now, but he says, Vishayantar anuvachedya tatparyantaram asahamana. That priti is of such nature that no other object interrupts it. In other words, its object is Krishna, and if any other object tries to interrupt its focus on Krishna, it doesn't get derailed, or it doesn't diverge, it just stays fixed on Krishna. And then you could say the reason for that is tatparyantaram asahamana, because it's intolerant of having an intent on anything else. In other words, it's one-pointedly fixed on Krishna, or on anukulya to Krishna. This is the nature of prema. So prema bhakti, in essence and ideal, is thus understood as Krishna sukh aika tatparya mayi bhakti. That is, bhakti possessed of intent solely upon the satisfaction of Krishna. Consequently, the presence of other desires based on self-centered intention is antithetical to the nature of prema bhakti. Nourishing such desires by using bhakti as a means to fulfill them is, moreover, contrary to the spirit of sadhana-bhakti, meaning to aspiration for bhava-bhakti, the aim or sadhya of sadhana-bhakti, the primary characteristic of which is, quote, tad eka sprihatam eva, desirousness solely of him, namely Bhagavan, alone. So this is another point that Jiva Gosvami makes in the Bhav Bhakti Prakaran in the Sindhu, that Bhava Bhakti has so many characteristics, but what is the Mukhya Lakshana, or the primary characteristic? That there is desirousness only of Krishna. Because someone might be detached from worldly things, someone might be fond of singing the glories of Krishna, someone might be fond of living in his dham, but their desire might not really be for Krishna within all of that. So someone might have those things, and those are symptoms of Bhava Bhakti, but just because someone has those things doesn't prove that they have Bhava Bhakti. But if someone has desire for nothing but Krishna, then they definitely have Bhava Bhakti, regardless of where they live or how loudly they sing or whatever their, externally observable characteristics may be. So that was Jiva Goswami's very significant point there in the Bhava Bhakti Prakaran, that Bhava Bhakti in essence means desirousness only of Krishna. So Sadhana-bhakti is that the aim of which is to arrive at the state of having only desire of Krishna. So, and why is that? It says, since Bhava Bhakti is, quote, intolerant of any other intent. In other words, if we put these statements together, if Bhava Bhakti is desirousness only of him, that means it's intolerant of having an intent on any other object. And fundamentally is anyabilashita shunya, free from desirousness of anything else. That is, as Jiva Goswami glossed the phrase, possessed of desire only for bhakti. Although ultimate benefit was affirmed to ensue, okay, so now I'm raising a challenge to this, because earlier in this chapter we also heard discussion of this phrase, akama sarva kamo va moksha kamo daridi. Whether you want moksha, whether you don't want anything, whether you want everything in the world, just do bhakti. And this broad encouragement to do bhakti was also explained. So now all of a sudden it's saying, no, you can't desire any of these things, you should have the aim of desiring only this. So which is it? Do bhakti only desiring this, and if you don't desire only this, should we give up bhakti? Or should we do bhakti regardless of whether we desire other things or not? So although ultimate benefit was affirmed to ensue even from engaging in bhakti to Krishna for the sake of fulfilling selfish desires, in verses 35 to 42 earlier in this chapter. As those who heard those classes recall, the example was given of Dhruva Maharaj, who performed bhakti with the aim of getting a kingdom, and got the kingdom, but in the process of getting the kingdom lost the desire for the kingdom, and got desire only for Krishna. So, yes, there's ultimate benefit in it, but that there isn't also a change in the attunement of the psyche along the way. No, there definitely will be that as well. So, although you can say, we don't want to define bhakti so rigidly that someone thinks, well, I desire other things, so I can't even do sadhana bhakti, so I'll just quit this whole business and go off and do something else. If we push it that rigidly, then we create a barrier to entry, and we actually contradict the Bhagavatam. So the Bhagavatam is saying, whatever you want, wherever situation you're in, whatever, still do bhakti. So we don't want to discuss these things so rigidly that we make it seem impossible. But at the same time, the purpose of this type of discussion we're having here is to show what is the actual ideal and the state that this whole process is meant to bring you to. Because if you pan it off too loosely, then people can carry on doing bhakti to fulfill their worldly desires, and it just never ends. So there has to be a gray area, if you will, or an intermediate zone where people are given encouragement to do bhakti, even if they're desirous of other things, yet they should also be given some encouragement to, and nourishment whereby they can learn and gradually adjust their psychological focus such that they desire Krishna and not these other things that might have been what even motivated them to initially do bhakti in the first place. So we need this kind of balanced, shift in emphasis, so to speak, for people to come from, square one, so to speak, or, infinite beginningless worldly samskars to ultimately reaching this state of having a samskar for bhakti that's predominant over and above everything else in the psyche. And you can't expect people to act and think and talk as if they have a sanskar for bhakti and nothing else when they actually don't, and their brains are, so to speak, scrambled by, innumerable worldly sanskaras. So you can't force it on the people too much, but at the same time, we have to have these conversations, so to speak. We have to know what is the ideal and what the sadhana process is and how it's meant to progress. And then it's up to the individual how much of a purification they can handle, how fast, essentially. So not too much that they burn out or they find it impossible and give up, but not too little that they just end up treading water. So, this balanced level of encouragement / pressure / support, whatever you want to call it. This is the art, if you will, of, supporting people on the path of bhakti. So, I elaborated without even reading the whole sentence. Although ultimate benefit was affirmed to ensue even from engaging in bhakti to Krishna for the sake of fulfilling selfish desires, in verses 35 to 42 earlier in this chapter, it should nevertheless be understood that such benefit is only afforded to such worshippers because of Bhagavan Sri Krishna's profound graciousness and the purifying nature of bhakti. Moreover, that benefit comes only gradually, and the supreme benefit found uniquely in Bhava Bhakti and Prema Bhakti will be experienced by such worshippers only after they gradually become purified of all self-directed desires. This is the import of Sriman Mahaprabhu's instruction to Sri Rupapad, also in chapter 19, to prune away all sub-branches from the creeper of bhakti, so that one's watering of the creeper of bhakti, that is, the sadhana-bhakti one performs, leads not to the proliferation of sub-branches, but rather specifically to the creeper bearing the fruit of prema, which is the acme of desirelessness. Elaborating on celebrated statements of Sri Samipad earlier on in his Bhavartha-dipika, Sri Jivapad also explains that it is specifically with respect to the nature of the desire that motivates one to perform bhakti that Srimad Bhagavatam speaks of its principal subject matter as, quote, the highest dharma wherein deceit is utterly rejected. Dharma projita kaitavotra parama. So if the dharma that's taught in the Bhagavatam is free from deceit, then what exactly is that deceit? Does it just mean not, lying to someone about something, or not, gambling on prediction markets, or whatever are, common types of cheating in the modern world? Is that what it's talking about? Is it just some kind of moral, prescription? Well, no, it's actually something far more difficult to avoid. So here's how Jiva Gosvami comments on that statement. So this is from his Kramasandarbha. He says, the dharma which is fundamentally described herein, that is in Srimad Bhagavatam, is verily the highest, parama. Why? Because of the description of it herein as being a producer of pure bhakti, by virtue of its singular intent, or tatparya, being that of Bhagavan's satisfaction. So notice you can see here also he's using the same language. What he defined priti as tatparyantaram asahamana, intolerant of another tatparya. Now he's saying that what is pure bhakti, or why is bhakti pure? Because it has a tatparya on the satisfaction of Bhagavan alone. So, by virtue of its singular intent being that of Bhagavan's satisfaction, in accord with the method described in verses beginning with the Bhagavad 1-6, quote, that because of which causeless and unobstructed bhakti to adhoksaja can come to be, and by which the self becomes fully satisfied, is alone the highest dharma of humanity. So he's giving a reference for his point by reference to that verse. In other words, he's saying that ahoituki there means Bhagavat Santosh Aik Tatparya. In other words, it's not motivated by any cause, meaning any selfish desire, So it's motivated only by an intent upon Bhagavan's pleasure. This is how he's deriving his argument. And then he elaborates, since it is also of such nature that within it deceit, kaitava, meaning duplicity in the form of pursuit of extraneous results, the objects of self-directed desires, is utterly rejected, on account of its, meaning this highest dharma's, being possessed of singular intent upon that is Bhagavan's satisfaction, meaning its being intent principally upon Bhagavan rather than oneself. Even the pursuit of moksha of all types, beginning with salokya, is repudiated by the prefix pra, or utterly, in the word projita, utterly rejected. So he defines then kaitava, or deceit, as the pursuit of other results or other objects. So what would be an other object? It would be an object that is based on a desire for oneself rather than a desire for Krishna. So if you read it this way, what he's saying here as the dharma that the Bhagavatam is all about is precisely the very same way that sadhana-bhakti has been defined. Or rather, that the object of sadhana-bhakti has been defined, namely bhava-bhakti or pure bhakti. So another commentary that Jiva Gosvami gives on this verse is also in the Bhakti-sandarbha, and that comes as follows. That bhakti, further, is to be known of two types, akaitava, non-deceitful, and sakaitava, deceitful. So what's the criterion? If there is desirousness only of that is of bhakti itself, there is akaitavatva, non-deceitfulness. And if there is desirousness related to another, that is an object other than bhakti, then there is kaitavatva. So in other words, an act of bhakti is meant to please Bhagavan. But if you're doing this act of bhakti that's meant to please Bhagavan, but you just want some other thing from it for yourself, then that's deceitful. That's cheating. But if you do this act of bhakti for Bhagavan, for the sake of Bhagavan, then that's non-deceitful. That's akaitava. So essentially, his criterion for deceitfulness is not just telling lies or being tricky or something like that, but it's whether the motivation for the bhakti that one performs is really for the pleasure of the object of the devotion, or whether it's for oneself. So in other words, in the world, someone might say, some, woman hunter guy might come up and say, "Oh, I love you." Right? But does he really love this woman, or does he just want to, enjoy himself with the woman's body or what have you? I don't want to get into all that, but, his quote-unquote "I love you" is not really that he truly loves or cares about the other one, but that he wants to fulfill his own desires with this other person. So that would be an instance of what you would call deceitful love, or, in the way the word deceit is being used here, where the quote professed or assumed idea that you love someone is that you actually at least care about their well-being. But if your actual motivation of saying that is just to woo the person, to get them to fulfill your desires, and you don't really care about them, then that's deceitful. So something like that, he's saying, if you perform bhakti for Bhagavan, but you really just want these benefits for yourself, and you don't actually care about pleasing Bhagavan beyond doing whatever's required to get what you want, then that's not really bhakti. That's deceitful. So he's saying that's kaitava. And so what the Bhagavatam is teaching, the bhakti that the Bhagavatam is teaching, is not just how to do rituals to get some unseen hand to work in your favor in the world and make you happy, but it's about actually having a relationship with Bhagavan, actually caring about Bhagavan, actually wanting to please Bhagavan, and not only that, but wanting to please him even if that causes displeasure or inconvenience for oneself, about even giving oneself to Bhagavan such that one cares about him even at one's own expense. That is, you could say, an extreme position to take, and not an easy state of mind to acquire, but we're told it has a sublime sort of fulfillment in it which profoundly exceeds the degree of blissfulness that could be found in anything less. So this is the hard proposal, so to speak, of the teachings of Mahaprabhu, the teachings of the Bhagavatam, to embrace such an ideal. Anyway, without elaborating excessively, this exact non-deceitful bhakti was also described earlier as being called, quote, unconditional or akinchana. Also, evidence in regard to its being of both types, that is, bhakti in general's potentially being either non-deceitful or deceitful, based on the desire that motivates its enactment, is to be understood from this very verse, the second verse of the Bhagavatam. Quote, here in the Bhagavatam is the highest dharma completely free from deceit. Dharma projita kaitavotra paramo. Accordingly, it is also stated in 7.752 in the Bhagavatam, quote, Hari is pleased by taintless bhakti, all else is a sham. So this is a statement of Prahlad, which comes later on, which is as follows. O sons of the Asuras, neither being a twice-born, being a deva, or being a rishi, nor conduct, nor being greatly knowledgeable, nor charity, nor austerity, nor worship, nor cleanliness, nor rites, are able to please Mukunda. Hari is pleased by taintless bhakti, all else is a sham. So, although those things are no doubt honorable in the world and not easy to do, in Prahlad's view, they're considered a sham. So why is that? Jiva Gosvami explains. Quote, by taintless means by desireless bhakti. So this is the kicker. What is it that taints bhakti? The desire with which you perform it. So if your desire is not really to please Bhagavan, then that bhakti is tainted. It's not nishkam, it's sakam. So bhakti is free from deceit or free from taint when it's done with the desire for Bhagavan, to please Bhagavan. When it's not done like that, it's tainted, it's deceitful. And something that's deceitful, but is shown as if it's authentic, what is that? That's a sham. That's a trick. When you present something saying it's one thing, or as giving the impression that it's one thing when it's actually another. So, quote, a sham means mere acting. In other words, it's just you're performing the activities like a pantomime, but you're not really doing that. Therefore, the bhakti of even a desirous bhakta, that is a bhakta desirous of some object other than bhakti, being said to be mere acting, is because of its being a mere imitation of bhakti, on account of the intention within it of bhakti's being a mere means to a personal object. That is, an objective desired by oneself for an interest separate from bhakti and Bhagavan's satisfaction. As actors sometimes perform such imitation of others, so it is such. Means so persons with desires, whether they consider themselves or are considered by others to be bhaktas or not, in other words, somebody might be a Jagat Guru with thousands of followers and praised as a great, great bhakta, but they may actually just be imitators of actual bhaktas until they become free from such desires, because they became a big, big guru because they wanted to be a guru, not because they really wanted to please Bhagavan. Further in this regard, that is in regard to pure bhaktis being performed without desires related to this world or the next, being free from desire related to this world is to be understood to also consist of the absence of acquiring a livelihood, prestige, and so forth by means of bhakti. In other words, if really you're doing bhakti for the sake of Bhagavan, then you're not doing it just for the social clout that you get by doing it, or just as a means of making your way in the world. So, if you're really doing it for Bhagavan, then you won't use this thing that's meant to please him as a way of, seeking the things that people typically seek in conventional life. So, Prahlad Maharaj embodies the taintless bhakti that he teaches in the aforecited verse, when he responds to Bhagavan Nrsimha after Bhagavan repeatedly requests Prahlad to accept a boon from him, as though enticing Prahlad to ask for some form of worldly enjoyment or moksha. So earlier on, when Prahlad is teaching his companions at school, he makes these statements about how bhakti should be desireless. But now, when Bhagavan himself is ready to give him whatever he wants, and is even sort of tempting him to ask for something that he wants, Prahlad Maharaj shows his desirelessness. Or in other words, he lives by the words that he says. So he's not someone like me who parrots all these teachings from the Bhagavatam and the Goswamis, but still doesn't manage to actually become purely desireless. He actually, when it really comes down to it, is that way. So this is shown as follows. Quote, "One who desires benedictions from you is not a servant, he is certainly a merchant." Not a servant, a merchant. Why? Then this is a little bit I'm just sticking in here from the Tika of Chakravarti Pad. He seeks to attain a great reward in the form of valuable possessions like elephants, horses, and chariots, and a high position like that of Indra or Brahma, in exchange for offering you just a few leaves, flowers, and foods. Means he's doing business with you. How do you make money? You buy something at one price that's cheap, and then you sell it or trade it for something that's more valuable. So you go pick a few fruits off the tree outside your village, and you give it to Bhagavan, and then say, okay, give me a whole kingdom. This is some tricky businessman, taking some cheap goods and trying to trade them for some very expensive goods. So he's saying, this is not serving Bhagavan, this is not really worshipping Bhagavan, you're just a merchant. So, one who is desirous of a blessing for oneself from a master is certainly not a genuine servant. And one who gives a blessing desiring one's own mastership over a servant is not a genuine master. I, however, am your desireless servant, and you are my guileless master. Otherwise, we both would have an interest. That is, we both would have ulterior motives, like a king and a courtier. So it means a king, he might, give charity to his subjects and so on, but in many cases he does that to show his own prestige and sustain, a favorable base, as they say in modern politics, to support his rule. And a courtier might go and assist the king with his affairs or give advice or help, conduct royal affairs, but it's not because he really truly wants to serve the king, but it's because he wants to have, a high position in the kingdom, or he wants the wealth that he acquires thereby, or he harbors some ambition for a coup, or whatever his motivation may be. So Prahlad is saying that a king and a courtier are not truly genuinely performing their respective roles in that relationship out of care and love for one another. They're doing so because they both get a certain benefit out of it for themselves. So a relationship between a bhakta and Bhagavan should not merely be that the bhakta should truly have bhakti for Bhagavan, should love Bhagavan out of adoration for Bhagavan, and similarly the Bhagavan should use his infinite capacity to express his love and care for his bhaktas. This is how it can and is meant to be. So, O best among givers of boons, if you wish to bestow desired boons upon me, then from you I pray for the boon of non-growth, that is, the non-occurrence within my heart of desires, by the appearance of which the senses, the mind, the vital airs, the body, dharma, composure, intelligence, modesty, beauty, strength, remembrance, and truthfulness are lost. So this is rather devastating. In other words, how far can even one desire take you off the path of dharma or the path of bhakti, right? Desires appearing in the heart can foil the senses, the mind, the pranas, the body, one's dharma, composure, intelligence, modesty, beauty, strength, remembrance, and truthfulness. Means one desire can ultimately cause someone to transgress or ruin all of these things. So, that is to say, are led in the wrong way, such that they fail to come in touch with you and your sweetness, or read in a more positive sense. If one has that one desire for something other than bhakti, then all of those faculties and merits that one has don't lead to ultimately experiencing Bhagavan, relishing Bhagavan's Madhurya, but they lead to some infinitely inferior end. So, we'll summarize all of this analysis as it relates to our definition. So, why did I bring all these comments from the Bhagavatam? Because they relate to the second aspect of the import of this phrase, sadhya bhava, that the aim of sadhana should be bhava. In other words, not anything else. So, the essential points made in these passages from Srimad Bhagavatam and the cited commentaries upon them are that pure bhakti is bhakti performed with no desire for any object other than bhakti itself, and that such pure bhakti is the principal directive or abhideya of Srimad Bhagavatam, as well as all Shastras in general, given that Srimad Bhagavatam conveys the ultimate essence of all the Shastras. Based on this conclusion, Sri Jiva also states an important corollary. When bhakti is performed because of a desire for another object, an object other than bhakti, meaning other than the satisfaction of Sri Bhagavan, be it any form of worldly enjoyment or any form of mukti, then that form of bhakti is not the form of bhakti that is the principal abhideya of the Shastras, and not what Sri Rupa defined in the verse under discussion as sadhana-bhakti. Rather, it is, as Sri Jiva has described here in his commentary on the definition of sadhana-bhakti, a quote, particular self-directed process, svarta kriya vishesh, meaning a particular type of self-interested undertaking. Prahlad Maharaj thus compares it to the tactic of a merchant and calls it a sham. Sri Jiva accordingly defines those who have utterly rejected deceit, that is, those who follow the highest dharma taught in Srimad Bhagavatam, as those whose sole purushartha is the service of Sri Bhagavan. The definition of sadhana bhakti under discussion thus elucidates two essential features of the Shastra's principal abhideya, which is the subject of the present chapter, namely, that only bhakti performed with the aim of bhava, that is, the aim of attaining prema bhakti to Sri Bhagavan, qualifies as sadhana bhakti. And two, the aim of sadhana bhakti, namely bhava, prema bhakti, is fit to be accepted as the ultimate purushartha because it is not a creation of sadhana bhakti, but rather an eternal existent that is brought into manifestation by means of sadhana bhakti. So that's what I have as far as discussion of this verse here, and then we'll get into a few additional points related to it when we look at the next two payars, which are the Caritamrita's own reiteration or teaching of the meaning of this verse. So I'll add some few other points as that discussion continues, but I'll leave it at that for today. So if anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or feedback of any other type, please feel free. Just one second. Okay, yeah.
So as part of my sadhana-bhakti, because just by doing the acts of bhakti, but not perhaps being mentally disposed towards pleasing Krishna, is part of sadhana bhakti practicing mentally, saying to myself, I want to make Krishna happy. Is this like something that one should incorporate in one's sadhana? Like, I'm chanting japa, I want to make Krishna happy. I'm doing the Thakur Seva, I want to make Krishna happy. Instead of just going about and just doing the activities, right, without any, kind of checking in within oneself that, why am I doing this? I want to make Krishna happy. Is this like would you think this is a good recommendation, or is it unnecessary?
Okay. Let me just check. Did y'all on Zoom hear what was just asked?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear him clearly.
Okay, thank you. So, I'll just say what comes to the top of my head on that topic. Something we came across, well, I forget if it was here in the other classes, but we'll get to it again soon, is in Jiva Gosvami's explanation of the limb of bhakti known as Dasya. He makes the point that Dasya refers not to rendering acts of service, but to simply fostering a sense of self that I am a servant. And he goes so far as to say that even without physically doing anything, one can achieve success in bhakti simply by fostering the resolve that I am Bhagavan's servant. So I'll take it in that line of thought that while physically performing an act like waving some incense or singing a pada or doing these various kind of conventional acts that we think of as bhakti, along with that, even to foster within one's heart and mind some affirmation or some resolve to satisfy Bhagavan, that is also an act of bhakti in and of itself. It's an act of remembrance. It's also an act which is endearing or pleasing to Bhagavan. So I would say that as per personal discretion, if someone finds that, nourishing to their sadhana, then I see no harm whatsoever. That seems perfectly fine to me. That one needs to do that necessarily, I don't know if you'd say it's absolutely compulsory, but that it could be beneficial seems very much so to me. That's my 2 cents.
Isn't this feeling what this Prabhu said, that the feeling I am a Dasa of Bhagavan and I'm doing this for his pleasure, doesn't this fall under Bhuta Shuddhi?
Perhaps you could categorize it that way. I mean, there are different Bhuta Shuddhi processes that have been mentioned, but you could use that as part of a Bhuta Shuddhi meditation, so to speak. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. All right, well, we can leave it at that for today. So we'll dive further into this subject matter in this. So it was a bit technical, and it'll still be a bit technical as we go further into the analysis. So we're here in the Sadhana-bhakti Prakaran, and that'll continue probably for another class or two, and then we'll start at the Vaidhi Bhakti, and we'll look at how that is defined in the coming section. So Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.